So again, in prep test 65, section 1, question number 2 introduces the main conclusion issue. Now, not quite that precise. Again, these are just rough numbers. It's the conclusions are the most heavily tested, but they're the most heavily tested. And it makes sense, because if you process information, right, but you don't spit it out the way we've been trained to spit it out, you probably should do something else. Now, let me just introduce the conclusion issue, because this is simply one iteration of it. So one iteration of it is I can require you to identify the overall conclusion, the main conclusion, they're identical. I can just use the word conclusion, the argument's conclusion. So that wording all introduces the same issue, which is what was the argument's conclusion. So whether I say it's the overall conclusion, okay, that means it might spill into 2 sentences. Or I say it's the argument's main conclusion, well, the argument can only have one main conclusion. Or if I just say the argument's conclusion, well, if I've said it's the argument's conclusion, I've said the same thing. That's just one iteration of conclusion questions. Okay. So, in addition to that, so you're going to get 2 or 3 of that. But in addition to that, with respect to conclusions, you're going to have deductive and inductive conclusions. Let's take them one at a time. What I'm going to do is now I'm going to switch a little bit and go over each of the different ways in which the conclusion issue can be presented to you, and the difference in solving them, because you don't solve them all the same way. So let's start with this one, which I think is among the, it can always be challenging, but generally speaking, the main conclusion should be pretty straightforward. I would not associate it generally with a high level of difficulty. Like if I wanted to test you on a main conclusion and make it a level 5 as a writer, I'd have to do a lot of work. So I can do that work, and I can make it a level 5. It would be challenging. So what is a main conclusion? Well, again, it's conceptual. When we construct an argument, we have an objective. There's some endpoint, right? Well, the endpoint is the argument's conclusion. So if you just get it, you say, okay, so I'm going to say, so what am I trying to convince you of? And whatever I'm trying to convince you of is my conclusion. So I may be trying to convince you to vote for candidate A, or I may be trying to convince you to vote for candidate B, and that's my starting point. And then I try to get you to do that through reasoning, through evidence. So the thing being explained is the conclusion, and the explaining is the reasoning, and again, that goes to the role in the argument of this stuff, right? In other words, how do you identify the argument's main conclusion if you don't understand the role the argument it plays? So the conclusion is distinct from its supporting stuff, because it's the conclusion. So the same thing, doesn't change the technique of slash marks, but now I'm looking for, it's not always going to work, but one way to spot a conclusion is when do you find yourself saying why? So if you read a sentence and it's just a fact, well then you're just going to say that was descriptive. If I say each side of a chessboard has 16 pieces, you're not going to say why, right? You're going to get it, it's descriptive, right? If I say the car was red, you're not going to say why, I just gave you a fact that the car is red. Okay, well that's not the conclusion, that's evidence. The conclusion is when you say, how come? So, if I write, I disagree, you should say, why? If I say, I agree, you should say, Why? Not thank you. You should say, why? Why do you agree? Because we may agree, you may agree with my conclusion, but we have different reasoning, and I actually don't agree with your reasoning, so we need to find out why. If I say, I recommend, what should you say?
Why?
Why? So, but you get the difference between I recommend and the car is red. So the conclusion is that I recommend. Now you may say why more than once. And that means they're ratcheting up the level of difficulty. And basically, that's the difference between a subordinate conclusion and a main conclusion. Which conclusion, when you said why twice, right? What was the broader statement you said why to? One of those whys is answered by the other, right? So, if I say the Yankees are going to win the World Series, you might say, well, let's hope. But you'd say why, and then I say, well, because they're going to win the AL East. Okay, well, aren't those two conclusions? One conclusion is they're going to win the World Series, right? And another conclusion is they're going to win the AL East. And I have to show both cases. But that they're going to win the World Series is a broader statement than they're going to win the AL East. You see it? Insofar as you guys know anything. I mean, you get it? I may say to you, my conclusion is the world is going to be safe for democracy, right? And then further in that argument, I say, after all, for the moment, the United States is safe for democracy. Well, wouldn't you ask, why are you saying the United States is safe for democracy? But that's subordinate to the broader statement that the world is safe for democracy. So, again, that's going to be a higher level. It's uncommon in this issue, not absent, but it's certainly uncommon. So let's see what happens. So you want to approach this with, now, can I pull the triggers? So we talk about strengthening and weakening, right? We said, be very, very careful, because there's always most strengthening and most weakening. How many overall conclusions can an argument have? One. How many main conclusions can an argument have? One. And if somebody says, give me the argument's conclusion, how many can I have? One. So here's where I need you. I need you to prepare. This is so straightforward. And so much like law school, right? You just finished this week, right? And if you want, you work on whatever you want to work on, right? If you want to work on strengthening and weakening this week, is it fair to say you can now identify the issue?
Yes.
Okay. If you want to work on main conclusions, is it fair to say you can now identify the issue? And that's what you do. And don't worry about time. You sit down and say, you know what, I'm going to get better at this. And you will if you put the time in. So, see what happens. Oh, we're just a couple of weeks late on this. I would do this in Brogue if my Brogue were any good, but it's not what it used to be. So I have Flores, I have a slash mark after the word day, slash mark after the word rare. What word do you see after the word rare?
Thus.
Yeah. I want you to stop for a second. This is section 1 in exam 65, and we're in question number 2. I want you to think for a second. You're being required to draw the overall conclusion of the argument, yes?
Yes.
And I don't know where they're going with this, so what I'm saying may be incorrect. But is it fair to say if you would put slash marks here, we would see the word thus at the beginning of the third sentence? Yes?
Yeah.
Talk to me. If you were knee-jerk, what would the answer be to the conclusion after you see the word thus? What follows the word thus? The argument's conclusion, right?
Yeah.
What have you been required to draw?
Overall.
Well, the overall, but the overall what?
Conclusion.
So who would be rewarded if the answer were in that sentence? If the, you know what I'm saying? If in other words, the person to be rewarded is a person who's not thinking on any kind of respectful level. The person who's just seeing the word thus, right? Oh, there comes the conclusion. Well, but here they're testing for the conclusion. You with me? If you're trying to get somebody to weaken an argument, then the word thus is going to introduce the conclusion because you're not testing the person on that. But when you're testing the person, I want to see if you can draw a conclusion. I'm certainly not, Peter's not going to put the word thus in front of it because I don't know if you understand the conclusion or not. I understand that somebody's told you the conclusion follows the word thus. So, I'll bet you, again, I've not looked at this in forever, I'll bet you there's an answer choice that is not credited that follows the language immediately after the word thus. So we have slash mark after day, the slash mark after rare, slash mark after carnations. But what you're saying is, what is the thing being explained? What am I asking why? Some people like to have green carnations on St. Patrick's Day. Does it sound like a fact?
Yes.
No, it's not the conclusion. But flowers that are naturally green are extremely rare. Does it sound like another fact?
Yes.
Thus, it is very difficult for plant breeders to produce green carnations, okay? So now we know that because of those two facts, it's very difficult for plant breeders to breed green carnations. I'm not asking why. Didn't we get the why in the two previous sentences? Don't we know why? Because they're extremely rare. So it was okay. Now, before St. Patrick's Day then, it is wise, see the word wise? It is wise, it's a recommendation. Before St. Patrick's Day then, it is wise for florists to stock up on white carnations, which are fairly inexpensive and quite easy to dye green. So forget the answer choices. What's the conclusion of the argument? Anybody? It's okay, you can get it wrong.
It's difficult for the plant breeders to produce green carnations.
But there are so many voices, they're all mumbling and they're all low.
It is wise for
I'm sorry?
It's just not going on white carnations because it's rare to get green.
Okay. How about, would it be fair to say that you have been told it is wise for florists to stock up on white carnations? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's got nothing to do with the green carnations. The reason we're stocking up on white carnations is because the green carnations are rare and hard to make, right? And so beyond that, now we're getting the recommendation. So the recommendation basically is forget the green carnations, stock up on the white carnations. Do you get it? Talk to me.
Yes.
Because we can break down the argument. Don't get it, we can break down the argument. Is that?
Well, I'm just reading this. So the first sentence is a fact. Second one is a fact. The third sentence is basically a mini conclusion of the two facts. Is it not?
You could, well,
Because that's why I thought, like it's a conclusion to a conclusion in a sense.
You-
Right? Because
that,
yeah, that's all. I just needed some clarification.
it builds on the first two. So it is, I think it's fair to characterize well, let's say this. Let's say if the argument ended on the third sentence.
Yeah, I would have.
All right, so you say, if it stopped there, then you would look at that and you'd say, well, the conclusion is that it's very difficult for plant breeders to produce green carnations. And that would almost be a deductive conclusion, not quite, but so yes, within that you could say, if this had been a role in the argument and they wanted to make this challenging, they could say the role in the argument of the third sentence is that it is a subordinate conclusion. Right, used to support the argument's main conclusion, which is, so we can't do green, so do white. It's so close to the facts they gave you that I could almost view it as another fact. But yeah, if the argument ended, and it could argue, definitely, if it ended on that third sentence, then it would serve as the argument's conclusion. So yeah, so you could absolutely say that this is a subordinate conclusion. But the argument doesn't stop on the third sentence.
Understood.
Yeah,
But-
yeah.
But it's like, in my mind, I'm looking fact, mini conclusion.
That's fine.
You know what I mean? So then that's like a conclusion supporting the main conclusion is,
I think your reasoning is better than mine. Well, because you're right, because the reason we're going with white is you've made the case that makes no sense to go with green. But now, if you've done that, right, and you got, the conclusion is, now you get the word wise kind of stands out. If you're going to say something, if somebody says to you that something is wise, wouldn't you ask, could you explain to me why it's wise? So that's like yelling at me. So see what answer choice A says. It is a good idea for florists to stock up on white carnations before St. Patrick's Day.
Yes.
You guys see it? And I assure you, well, you know, B, flowers that are naturally green are very rare. Isn't that given to you as a premise in the argument?
Yes.
But see what they're doing, right? It's role in the argument. If you understand the role in the argument, you're looking at B. First of all, I'm not looking at B because there can only be one answer. But if I were, no, the role in the argument is to give me a premise. C, there are some people who like to have green carnations on St. Patrick's Day. Well, that's a premise in the argument. Yes, you see it. But it's seeing this, it's seeing this role in the argument that gives you the understanding. D, white carnations are fairly inexpensive and can easily be dyed green. Well, that's evidence in support of the argument's main conclusion that we should use white carnations. And E, it's very difficult to breed green carnation. That is I'll bet you 80% of the people who got this wrong, who didn't guess, chose E. George.
Oh, I was just gonna say, if this argument ended on the third sentence,
Yeah.
then D would be the right answer, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, I just.
Yeah.
But they were looking for the overall conclusion, which A applies.
Well, even if you said you wouldn't need overall, because this is the argument's main conclusion.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? A subordinate conclusion, if that is the role of the third sentence, right? If the role is a subordinate conclusion, well, the reason we're calling it subordinate is because it's not main,
Okay.
right? So it can only have one main conclusion. Overall can be used either to suggest, which it doesn't here, but overall can be used to suggest that the conclusion will flip into two sentences. So maybe if I conclude, Peter will have dinner tonight because he was really hungry, or Peter will have dinner tonight, period. After all, he is very hungry. Well, then you can say the overall conclusion is I'm having dinner tonight because I'm very hungry. In other words, you can attach the reasoning to it. Okay, now we'll have to get creative in finding other main conclusion issues, because you're going to get about two of these, so let's make sure we do one or two more. Number 9. Oh, yay. Number 9. Right there. Okay, number 9. Slash mark. So the way it's introduced, which one of the following most accurately expresses the conclusion drawn by the argument as a whole? Okay, I got it. I have a slash mark after the word gallop, and I have a slash mark after the word legs, after the word breaking, and then I'm done. Okay, let me read it, and again, read it textually. Some paleontologists have suggested that the Apatosaurus, a huge dinosaur, was able to gallop. Okay, so that's going to be explored. Did the Apatosaurus gallop or not? Next sentence. This, however, is unlikely. So what is, up to now, what is the conclusion right now? What is unlikely? It's unlikely the Apatosaurus galloped. You see it? Now, what you're saying to yourself, if the rest of what I'm reading explains that, well, I just read the conclusion, which I imagine it is. I'm going to keep reading for sure, right? But do you get what you're doing? You're saying, okay, first you say there's this debate among paleontologists as to whether it was able to gallop, and then the author breaks out and says it's unlikely. So the author now has to defend that and tell me, okay, why is it unlikely? And if that's the case, then that's the conclusion. It's unlikely they galloped. And here goes. This is unlikely because galloping would probably have broken its legs. That helps explain it. You know, experiments with modern bones show how much strain they can withstand before breaking. By taking into account the diameter and the density of the Apatosaurus leg bones, it is possible to calculate that those bones could not have withstood the strain of galloping. Help me out here. Isn't everything beneath the clause, this, however, was unlikely, designed to explain the clause that it was unlikely. Yes. So the conclusion is, it's unlikely the Apatosaurus galloped. So you don't need me. You can just pick the answer right now. Yes? Let's see, I just want to see if there's any question, because I'm thinking, to me, this is so straightforward. They can only put in one answer, right? Everybody okay? Does the answer C
Yeah.
make sense? Talk, and if it doesn't make sense, please, let's have a conversation. But the answer C here is, well, let me read them, right? But again, you have to have something in your mind before you look at those answer choices. You simply have to. A, galloping would probably have broken the legs of the Apatosaurus. Well, no. This is unlikely. The conclusion is it's unlikely they galloped at all. Wouldn't that be a piece of evidence supporting the proposition that they probably didn't gallop? Talk to me, do you see it? So A is citing, and the role of the argument is citing a piece of evidence that helps explain why they didn't gallop, because if they did gallop, what probably would have happened? Broken the legs. Come on, do you see it? It's just not a, slow down. B, it is possible to calculate the Apatosaurus leg bones could not have withstood the strain of galloping. Isn't that a premise? But you see the similarity.
Now, do you call it a premise or is it a fact?
Same, those are interchangeable.
Okay.
Yeah, premise, fact, and evidence are all interchangeable. That's, I use those words, and as this exam uses them. But you get what's happening, because this is never going to change. Every time you're asked for main conclusion, the answer choices are going to be premises, which are not the answers, a subordinate conclusion, which is not the answer, or the main conclusion, which is the answer.
Repeat what you just said.
Or the main conclusion, which is the answer. In other words,
Okay.
every single time, they are so stuck. They are testing not anything about Apatosauruses and the bones and whether they can gallop or not, they can kill us. What they're testing is, do you understand role of the argument? Do you understand when you read a sentence, it's there because it's playing a role. You know, it's like the human frame, you know, skeleton plays a role. So an argument has a skeleton and it plays a role. I want you to understand it. I do. C, the claim of the paleontologist that Apatosaurus was able to gallop is likely to be incorrect. It's like, yeah, duh. Yes. Well, but how cool is it? You can take this test, right? And when you say duh, it's because it really was duh. So I don't know who got that wrong. I mean, I don't mean it again.
Yeah, you gotta be careful with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you can get this. In other words, that's not understanding number 9, right, and breaking it down and getting it with word is not analogous to understanding the epistemology of Aristotle. You know, there's some stuff like, I have no clue what you just asked me. D, if galloping would have broken the legs of the Apatosaurus was probably unable to gallop. Again, it's a fact in the argument. And E, modern bones are quite similar. Those are all facts in the argument. Well, all the answers that are not credited, but you wouldn't know that if you didn't understand the role in the argument. And when's the last time you've read for the role of the argument? Yeah.
So, what's your average time? A minute and a half per question, more or less, or 2 minutes?
You have a minute and 20 seconds. So you have 80 seconds per question, right? And the goal here is, and again, that's the purpose of a psychometric test. It purposely refrains from giving you enough time unless you're free, in which case you have enough time. But you have a miserable life, but you have enough time. So again, that plan is how long on those level ones where the answer choice is A or B, which you can extrapolate out, say 10 of them, 8 of them, over the course of a test or something, right? It should not take you 80 seconds. It's going to take 80 seconds for a person who has no standard, right? Because I'm just clear and convincing, so I'm willing to be wrong. I'm not going to be wrong a lot, but I will be wrong, right? but you have to have a standard. And then you have to have that psychological ability to let go. You know, not to say, no, I need to be sure, I need to be sure. The psychometric test doesn't allow for that. If you want to be sure, what are you gonna run out of almost instantly?
Time.
Because you can't be in this profession. Do you get, I want to be sure implies a standard, right? And doesn't it imply a standard of I have to be right? Well, think about it, right? But it's a psychometric test. If I have the standard that I have to be right, when do I ever go to trial? Right, that's right, never. So it's really, have I mentioned it's a really cool test?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's easy, but that's that's the whole point, right? If it's easy, what have I spent my life doing? Right, but okay. Are we okay with question number 9?
Yeah.
Is that sufficient? Do you have enough? I mean, because, again, we could spend an entire class on every issue, but I want to get through issues. So does that give you enough so that you could go home this week, identify the main conclusions, right? So in volume 5, you're going to have about 20 of these. It's going to be about 2 per exam, right? So it's not a heavy lift. If you find, which you will, that of the 20, say 15 of them always show up, number questions 1 through 12. And of those 15, when you brief them, you look at 12 of them and you say, if I was patient, I could get this right. Wouldn't that give you information on exam day? So that's what I want you to do. I want to move into the other conclusion issues now, but that is, to me, the most approachable conclusion issue. So you get it? There can only be one answer. Don't overthink it. Clear and convincing. What is being explained? That's it. Yes?